Long time no see. Welcome back to the Napoleonic series. Today we're going to be looking at Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, 1812, one of the most epic videos in this entire series, and I believe it is the longest video in this series as well if you don't count the Marshall ones. But of the Napoleon storyline, this is the longest one. It's certainly the one filled with the most drama, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this video. Well, what else can I say? One of my favorite series here on YouTube. Become a patron on Epic History TV's Patreon page there. Go support them. Love this channel. Can't say enough about them. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Without further ado, let's get into one of the most epic retreats of all time and see that luck truly is on Napoleon's side. Let's go. Sadly mistaken.
Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen. But for the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever encountered. And as winter closes in, his army begins the most infamous retreat in history.
The retreat. That's the best way to put it. The retreat.
The 15th of September, 1812. 83 days after invading Russia, a week after his costly victory at Borodino, Napoleon entered Moscow.
And if you haven't seen that video yet, go check it out. But Borodino, it was the show-off between the French and the Russians, really the first time in this campaign that there would be a truly epic battle. The Emperor wants to give battle, and it was Napoleon's bloodiest day, as per the title there. The casualties were absolutely immense, and Napoleon went on to actually remember it as his most terrible battle, right? One of the most terrible days of his campaigns, of his career. And like I said, if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. I'll leave a thing in the top left here.
He expected to be greeted by dignitaries, formally offering the city's surrender.
Nope, it burned.
Instead, he discovered that 90% of Moscow's inhabitants had fled. A fire had started the previous night and was blamed on drunken soldiers. But over the next 48 hours, fires continued to break out across Moscow, until most of the city was ablaze. Count Fyodor Rostopchin, the city's governor, had ordered that Moscow be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands.
Yep. And you have to think too, so that's a few 100,000 people, or maybe even more. I'm not sure the population of Moscow at this time. I mean, modernly it's obviously in the millions, but you have to think that these are all refugees that are now overflowing into other cities around the country. And my question that I have, and I wish, they're not going to get into it, but what about the 10% that actually stayed, right? Why did they manage to stay in Moscow? Of the other 90%, where did they flee to? Did a lot of them flee to the capital, some of the other major cities at the time? I'm kind of curious of what happened of the people here. Because although it's not the focus of these videos, I also think that it would be really cool to sort of get into more of what was the average everyday person's life like during these campaigns and how did they affect them. I think that could be a cool video series maybe.
And now fires were being started deliberately by Russian criminals, freed from jail and acting on police orders. French soldiers rounded up and shot any they could catch. But the inferno was impossible to contain. In 4 days, 2/3 of Moscow was destroyed.
Jeez.
With the fires finally under control, Napoleon's soldiers turned their attention to systematically looting the ruined city. While from his new quarters in the Kremlin, Napoleon sent a letter to Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg, inviting him to make peace and end the war. He received no reply.
Yep.
Napoleon waited, confident that Alexander would eventually negotiate. But as the days passed, he grew increasingly uneasy. Cossack raids were disrupting his vital communications with Paris, as well as the arrival of supplies, while the steady attrition of French forces and Russian reinforcements meant Napoleon was outnumbered for the first time in the campaign. Rumours also reached him that his reluctant allies, Prussia and Austria, were in secret talks with his enemies. Napoleon had proposed that the army winter in Moscow, but that now looked too dangerous. Reluctantly, he accepted that the army would have to move back to Smolensk to find safe winter quarters. Napoleon knew how severe Russian winters could be, but continued to put off his departure, reassured by fine October weather, and hoping that at the last minute there might be a message from Alexander offering peace. It never came. On the 13th of October, the first light snow fell. 5 days later,
I wonder if that was a Friday the 13th out of curiosity.
Kutuzov launched a surprise attack on Murat's advance guard at Vinkovo and defeated it. Napoleon, stung into action, gave the order for the army to leave Moscow the next day.
In the middle of October.
Our video sponsor, the legendary World of Tanks, is the home of online multiplayer.
That's fantastic. World of Tanks in your Napoleon game. There you go. Your Napoleon campaign, sorry. I've played World of Warships. That was kind of fun, but I haven't really played World of Tanks. I'm more of a War Thunder kind of guy.
100,000 men of the Grande Armée left Moscow in a column 10 miles long, with an estimated 40,000 carriages and carts.
40,000!
There were women and children too, army wives and the vivandières, the women who cooked for the soldiers, as well as some civilians. Every wagon and pack was stuffed with as much food and loot as possible.
Yeah.
As he set off, Sergeant Bourgogne of the Imperial Guard made an inventory of his pack. It contained several pounds of sugar, some rice, some biscuit, half a bottle of liqueur, a woman's Chinese silk dress embroidered in gold and silver, several gold and silver ornaments, amongst them a piece of the cross of Ivan the Great. Besides these, I had my uniform, a woman's large riding cloak, 2 silver pictures in relief, 12 inches long and 8 high, all in the finest workmanship. Also several lockets and a Russian prince's spittoon set with precious stones. I wore over my shirt a yellow silk waistcoat, which I had made myself out of a woman's skirt. Over that, a large cape lined with ermine and a large pouch, hung at my side by a silver cord. This was full of various things, amongst them a crucifix in gold and silver and a little Chinese porcelain vase. Then there were my firearms, powder flask, and 60 cartridges in the box.
So out of everything that all this is for, right? Half of this is to keep warm, a little bit of it is firearms, the rest of it is all loot. Yeah, and now you got to march from Russia all the way back to friendly territory in Poland, which isn't about to become too friendly, theoretically all the way back to France. Crazy.
This heavily encumbered army did not yet realize it was in a race against time. The Russians were beginning to move against the flanks of Napoleon's 550-mile-deep salient. That very day, Wittgenstein's army was driving back Marshal Saint-Cyr's outnumbered force at Polotsk and drawing Victor's 9th Corps west to support them. In the south, Admiral Chichagov's advance had Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps falling back to cover Warsaw. The corridor was closing. And then there was the weather. Though Napoleon was confident his army could reach winter quarters in Smolensk in 20 days, well before the more extreme temperatures were due to hit. Napoleon planned to withdraw via Kaluga, through unspoilt country where the army could forage for supplies. But Kutuzov sent General Dokhturov's 6th Corps to block the road at Maloyaroslavets. In fierce fighting, Italian troops of Eugene's 4th Corps drove the Russians out of the town. It was a hard-won victory, reminiscent of the fighting at Borodino. Kutuzov.
Just think of the misery that these troops are going through, right? They get to Moscow, it's burned, and sure, they get some loot, they get some treasure, I guess, but then you gotta slog all the way back in a 10-mile, what's that, 13 kilometers, I think 1.3, right? But a 10-mile long convoy down one road, and you're being attacked by the Russians while it's going on. I mean, I'd imagine that the Russians are probably sending cavalry scouts out, and the walking French troops are probably seeing them and knowing what's coming. Just, I can't imagine how miserable that would be.
Now stood between Napoleon and Kaluga. Napoleon now took the unusual step of conferring with his marshals. And after discussing various options, he decided that rather than seek another major battle, they would retreat the way they'd come, along the Smolensk road.
Interesting.
Napoleon had hoped to avoid this route, as it meant marching back through country already stripped bare of supplies. The day after the fighting at Maloyaroslavets, Napoleon was nearly captured by a group of Cossacks, and saved only by General Rapp's charge at the head of his escort.
Can you imagine?
After this close shave, Napoleon had a phial of poison made up, which he carried around his neck in case of capture.
Can you imagine if he was? How that would have changed history.
Napoleon's army set off on its new course, shadowed at a respectful distance by Kutuzov's army to the south.
Like I said, troops are seeing the Russians.
They passed the old battlefield of Borodino, a grisly, unnerving sight.
Yep.
Where crows pecked at half-buried corpses.
Yeah, they definitely were not as intact as this too, considering that was from a few weeks ago. Like, imagine that, right? Seeing one of your, maybe even one of your fallen comrades again.
Relentless marching quickly began to tire out men and horses.
Yep.
A few days later, the temperature fell below freezing. The army's overworked, starving horses died en masse. Discipline began to break down, as some drivers simply dumped the sick and wounded by the roadside to try to ensure their own survival. As the French column became increasingly strung out, General Miloradovich, commanding Kutuzov's advance guard, fell on Davout's rear guard, outside Vyazma. For a few hours, Davout's 1st Corps was cut off, until Eugene and Ney came to his rescue.
Marshal Ney.
The battle ended with street fighting in Vyazma, as the French hastily evacuated the burning town. For the soldiers of the Grande Armée, so unaccustomed to retreats and routes, Vyazma was an alarming, demoralizing blow.
Exceeded imagination. Yeah. That's really accurate.
On the 4th of November, it began to snow heavily. The next night, temperatures plummeted to -20 degrees centigrade.
Oh.
Few men or women had proper winter clothing or access to shelter. Many froze to death overnight. The next morning, wagons and guns were abandoned. Many soldiers sought to save themselves, ignoring officers, stealing horses and food, and leaving the column to scour the countryside for supplies.
And then what? Then what would have happened? You're hundreds of miles away from home.
Many of these foragers were found by the Cossacks.
Okay, there you go.
Some cut down or lanced, others robbed of every possession and left to freeze. In a few cases, they were handed over to peasants, eager for retribution against the foreign invaders who had plundered all they owned. As the army struggled on towards Smolensk through blizzards, Napoleon ordered Eugene's 4th Corps to strike out for Vitebsk, where there were large French supply depots. But Vitebsk had already fallen to the Russians. 4th Corps was too weak to fight its way through, and rejoined the army, minus its artillery and most of its baggage.
You gotta imagine too, there are some troops here that are Italians, that are Germans, that are Austrians, people that are not even French, that are not fighting for their, for their emperor. Well, they are their emperor, but whatever, right? For their own homegrown emperor, their own country, their own this, their own that. There's no reason, right, outside of one man's or the elite's glory, right? What would you do in that situation? I mean, deserting, probably not the best odds, but if you could ever find a way, I mean, I don't think most people would hesitate. I don't think I really would, but let me know, what would you do?
A colonel who saw 4th Corps at this stage described men without shoes, almost without clothes, exhausted and famished, sitting on their packs, sleeping on their knees, and only rousing themselves out of this stupor to grill slices of horse meat or melt bits of ice. Just 3 weeks after leaving Moscow, a third of the army was dead or captured. About half the rest formed a growing army of stragglers, men without units, prepared to fight only to survive. Napoleon reached Smolensk on the 9th of November. The first troops into town ransacked the supply depots, leaving nothing for those who followed, including Ney's rearguard, which arrived 6 days later.
Yep.
Napoleon had hoped to make Smolensk his winter base, but the state of the army and lack of supplies meant the retreat had to continue.
It's gotta go to Minsk.
But the 5 days he spent there gave Kutuzov time to circle ahead and prepare an ambush. When the French retreat resumed, he struck 30 miles west of Smolensk at Krasny.
I do have one question, though, is that we obviously are well aware here of the supply issues of Napoleon, but what are the supply issues like of Kutuzov here? I know obviously they're on home territory and that, but aren't they running into similar supply issues? I'm kind of curious of that exactly. Obviously Napoleon's on the march and they can only stay in certain places because they're being attacked, but how is Kutuzov also keeping these supply lines going? Are they just scavenging off the land as well? But the land's barren, the land's basically desecrated. So I'm actually kind of curious of how exactly, because I mean supply goes both ways, right? So how are the Russians doing this?
In 3 days of desperate fighting through knee-deep snow, Napoleon used his Imperial Guard to hold open the road, as Eugene and Davout's corps fought their way through the ambush with heavy losses. 2 regiments of the Young Guard were ordered to make a sacrificial counterattack to keep the Russians at bay, and were virtually annihilated. Kutuzov held back many of his troops and was blamed for not trying to destroy Napoleon's army when he had the chance. It's possible he was concerned at the number of raw conscripts in his own army, also suffering terribly in the freezing conditions.
Right. Marshal Ney. Can't wait till the Marshal series.
Not every French corps broke through at Krasny. Marshal Ney and his 6,000-strong rearguard arrived on the 18th of November to find the road blocked by 60,000 Russian troops, and no sign of the promised support from Davout's 1st Corps. Ney's men hurled themselves against the Russian lines with desperate courage, but were mown down. Rejecting several invitations to surrender, Ney led the survivors in a daring night crossing of the Dnieper River, then across 45 miles of open country under constant attack from Platov's Cossacks to reach Orsha. By the time Ney rejoined the army, his rearguard was down to just 800 fighting men, leading a column of several thousand stragglers. The army regarded his escape as a miracle, and when Napoleon heard of it, he immediately dubbed Marshal Ney the bravest of the brave.
Crazy. What else could you do? Only beginning. Okay. What was it all before?
Napoleon had escaped one trap, but now 3 Russian armies were closing in from different directions and outnumbered him nearly 3 to 1.
And now we see the amazing amount of luck that Napoleon has to him.
From the east, Kutuzov's main army with 65,000 men. From the north, Wittgenstein with 30,000, steadily driving back Marshal Victor's
I
Ninth
think this
Corps.
is it, right? Like,
And
it's
from
gotta
the
be
south,
it.
Admiral Chichagov's army of Moldavia with 34,000, having detached General Ostensacken with 30,000 to prevent Schwarzenberg's Austrians and Reynier's Saxon Corps marching to Napoleon's aid. Napoleon was heading for Minsk, a major French supply base with vast stores of the food, clothing, shoes and ammunition that his army so desperately needed. But on the 21st of November, disastrous news arrived. Minsk had fallen to Chichagov. He then marched on Borisov, driven out the Polish garrison, and captured its bridge over the Berezina River.
That's it. What?
By rights, the
I mean, I know what happens here, but that's it, right? Like, seemingly this is it. This is the end. How is he going to get out of this?
Berezina ought to have frozen solid by now, so Napoleon could have crossed anywhere. But a sudden thaw had turned the river into a torrent of ice and freezing water. Napoleon was at least joined by the hard-fighting Marshal Oudinot and his Second Corps, which hadn't suffered as badly as the main column on its retreat from Polotsk. Oudinot launched an immediate counterattack on Borisov and retook the town, but couldn't stop the Russians burning the bridge. With no other bridge for miles in either direction, it seemed Napoleon's exhausted army was finally doomed. But there was one sliver of hope. Polish cavalry had found a ford across the river near the village of Studienka. Napoleon issued a flurry of orders. Second Corps was to fake preparations for a river crossing south of Borisov. Victor's Ninth Corps, arriving from the north, was to form a rear guard east of Studienka to hold the Russians at bay, while engineers worked as quickly as possible to build pontoon bridges across the river and win Napoleon's army a fighting chance of escape.
Like, he must, you know? Really stacked up against all odds here, and still is going to manage to do it. Also, pontoon bridges, way to go, man. The amount of pontoon bridges we've seen in this series.
On the afternoon of the 25th of November, General Eblé's Dutch engineers began building 2 300-foot pontoon bridges across the Berezina River.
How fast can someone build a pontoon bridge? That's also a question. I have more questions in this video than the usual one, but I've seen a lot of pontoon bridges, as I've said.
They worked day and night, sometimes chest deep in freezing water, and completed both bridges in less than 24 hours. Few of the engineers survived the ordeal. Chichagov had been totally fooled by the diversion south of Borisov, and was moving his troops south to face it, allowing Napoleon's army to begin crossing its rickety bridges virtually unopposed.
Wow.
Oudinot's Second Corps led the way to secure a bridgehead, followed the next day by the remnants of the main army. Priority was given to formed troops, still able to fight. For the time being, the army's vast crowd of stragglers remained on the far bank. By the time Chichagov realized his mistake, and began moving north, Napoleon had troops in place to defend the crossing. On the east bank, General Partonneux's 12th Division, 4,000 relatively fresh troops from Victor's 9th Corps, formed the rearguard. As Platov's Cossacks approached from the east, the vanguard of Kutuzov's main army, Partonneux tried to rejoin 9th Corps. But caught in a swirling blizzard, with visibility down to 50 meters, he marched straight into Wittgenstein's army.
Oh, God.
His entire division was killed or captured.
A whole division.
The next morning, Chichagov and Wittgenstein launched coordinated attacks on both sides.
It's a miracle they only have lost one division so far. I mean, look at this. The fact that Chichagov was completely fooled by the fake bridge. I mean, good order, right? Well done on Napoleon, again, to somehow completely save himself from seeming doom.
Sides of the river. There was desperate fighting on the west bank, where Marshal Oudinot was, yet again, seriously wounded, but his Swiss infantry held the line, until General Doumerc's cuirassiers, the army's last heavy cavalry, charged and routed the Russians. At great cost, Polish and German troops of Victor's rearguard held off the Russians until dark, then pulled back across the bridges. For 2 nights, officers had been trying to get the vast camp of stragglers to cross the bridges when they weren't being used. But with temperatures reaching -30 centigrade, they'd preferred to stay put, huddled around their fires.
Even as a Canadian, like -30, ooh.
At dawn on the 29th,
Yep.
with the army leaving and the Russians approaching, thousands of stragglers surged in panic towards the bridges. Dozens were crushed underfoot.
Yep.
Others fell or were pushed into the water, or tried to swim, which was certain death. When French engineers burned the bridges at 9 a.m, thousands were cut off and left to the mercy of the advancing Cossacks. Some became prisoners. Others were simply put out of their misery.
Appalling misery.
Since the retreat began 43 days earlier, the Grande Armée had marched nearly 500 miles, under constant attack, starved, exhausted, and for the last 23 days, in lethal sub-zero temperatures, without proper clothing or shelter. In that time, the fighting strength of the Grande Armée had been reduced from around 124,000 men to 20,000.
20,000? 100,000 were killed. Oh my, Alter man. He marched in with 500,000 men, and there's 20,000 left. Wow.
Many stragglers still following the army.
So 40,000, but still.
As the retreat continued to Vilna, the weather turned even worse, with temperatures falling to -37 degrees centigrade.
37? What?
The Russian armies at least now held back, leaving the winter, Cossacks and Russian peasants to finish off the invaders. On the 5th of December, Napoleon left the army, travelling incognito across Europe at breakneck speed, and reaching Paris in just 13 days.
Impressive, nonetheless. Just
Naturally,
abandoned his entire army.
English satirists capitalized on Napoleon seeming to abandon his defeated army. And many soldiers did regard it as an act of betrayal.
Yep.
But his generals supported his decision to leave. There'd already been one attempted coup against Napoleon in Paris, and there was much work to be done to rebuild the army and reassure France's allies.
Because, I mean, what a political disaster, right? I mean, Austria, always on the back of France anyways, is definitely at this point trying to look to get out of this alliance. Prussia as well. They're still dealing with Spain, right? In case one has forgotten, right? There's still the Spanish ulcer that's occurring here. His allies in Italy are probably getting nervous. I mean, this just seems like almost a complete collapse.
On the 9th of December, 51 days...
And the War of 1812 is also going on, so at least the British are preoccupied in that.
After the retreat began, around 20,000 ragged survivors of the Grande Armée began crossing the Niemen River back into friendly Polish territory. According to legend, Marshal Ney was the last man across.
Of course he was. Badass. Can you imagine the feeling to finally crossing all of that? Like I've never been in such a brutal situation as something like this, and like I just can only imagine the amount of, what is even the word that you would use to describe how that feels? Like a feeling of freedom, of hope, of happiness. I can't even picture it. I can't imagine that. I'd love to see if there was any handwritten accounts of what it was like to finally reach back into territory, though I'd imagine of the 20,000 that are left, the last thing that they're thinking about is writing down their experiences. No more than a memory. 60 men of an entire corps. Disaster.
Napoleon's invasion of Russia had proved to be one of the greatest military disasters in history.
Yep.
He had made fatal miscalculations about geography, logistics, and above all, Russia's political and strategic response to his invasion. These blunders cost his empire around 500,000 men, as well as 250,000 horses and 1,000 cannon.
250,000
Put
horses.
Another way, of every 12 men who marched into Russia with the Grande Armée, one was killed in action or died of wounds. 2 were taken prisoner, one of whom died in captivity. 7 died from disease or the effects of climate. Just 2 returned alive.
And then it would only be 100 years and a little bit more years later that Russia again would be invaded by German troops in World War I, which was also not as much as a disaster, but the amount of human life that was cost, and then in the Second World War as well, the amount of human life that was lost in Russia. Is there any plains in existence that has seen more human blood spilled on it than the plains of Russia? I don't know, but it's got to be up there.
Contrary to myth, many more soldiers had died in the summer advance from heat, typhus and dysentery than were lost in the winter retreat.
Yeah.
Russian military casualties were estimated at 150,000, and a huge but unknown number of civilian deaths.
Yeah, gotta think about that too, right?
The Russian campaign was a catastrophe for Napoleon. Not just in lost troops and resources, but in damage to prestige and reputation. That winter, all his enemies sensed weakness and prepared to join forces against him. But the Emperor wasn't going down without a fight. Back in Paris, he admitted to his ministers, "Fortune has dazzled me, gentlemen. I've let it lead me astray. Instead of following my plan, I went to Moscow. I thought I'd make peace there. I stayed too long. I've made a grave mistake, but I'll have the means to repair it."
I give one thing about Napoleon is that out of all the leaders that you read about, the political leaders that end up in military disasters, at least he has the intelligence, the bravado, the decency to say that I've made a mistake, but I have the means to fix it, right? To actually say that a mistake was made and that blunders were had and that it falls on his responsibility. It's admirable, no? Still, Absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. I really hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed that one a lot. Not the typical video where I can pause and give tons of information because this is all new to me, but I really, really hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'm going to do 3 more videos after this that are non-Napoleon related, and then we'll be right back on the Napoleon train. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your support. Recently passed 1,500 subscribers. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Take care. All the best. Till next one.